Hi friends, welcome back to my channel. I'm Lora Rolling and this is part 5 of the Christmas tree ornament tutorial. This is the Christmas tree ornament that we are making. It is so cute. I'm just in love with it. If you haven't seen parts 1, 2, 3, and 4 yet, you're going to want to watch those first and then come back to this one. I'll have those videos listed down below in the description. Go ahead and go watch those and then come back to this one. Today we're going to take the units that we've made in parts 1 through 4 and combine them all together to make the ornament. Then we're going to bead the cap and add the ribbon. We just have a few materials to get ready, so let's get them listed and then we can get started. Let's go. Okay, so I thought I would pop in and tell you what has been going on in my life. I never do this, but I thought that I would just share with you. The reason why it has taken me 8 days to get this 5th part on is a couple of things that came to be. First of all, I got a new phone. I switched from Android to iPhone, and if you've ever done that, you know what a challenge it is to learn all the different aspects and the apps and all the different things when it comes to changing a phone. So I changed my phone. Excuse me. Then my Android, I decided to use it because I didn't trade it in. I just upgraded it to an S22, and that's the one that I usually film on. So I decided to continue using it. And I deleted a whole bunch of stuff on it because I was just going to use it for filming. It's basically my main camera. When I deleted it, I actually deleted the entire Christmas tree ornament tutorial. It takes me 2 days to make these part 5s. So the fact that I deleted them all sent me into panic mode. I had no idea if I was going to be able to recover them. Luckily, after going to a repair shop, calling Samsung itself, and then going to my local shop that I bought my new phone at, they helped me to recover those videos. So that's what you're seeing now. It was a mess, and I'm so glad that we were able to recover it, but that's why it took me so long. It was a struggle. Anyways, here comes the video. I hope you enjoy it. So the first thing that we're going to need, of course, are the 20 units that we have already completed in parts 1, 2, 3, and 4. So you definitely need all 20 of your units. You'll also need some beads to bead the cap. And of course, we're using all Miyuki Delicas. I have opaque carnation, white pearl, and opaque yellow AB. And I'm just going to call this pink, white, and yellow. For implements, I'm going to use my long nose pliers, and to cut my thread, I'm going to use my scissors. We will also need our ornament. This is a 2.36 inch plastic crafting ornament. I get it in the 12-pack at my local hobby store. If you don't have them yet and you want to get your hands on just 1 or 2 of them, they're sold individually in my Etsy shop. Of course, we're also going to need some beading thread and a beading needle. I like to use the Eslon Fire in the color Crystal, and I use 4-pound. You can also use 6-pound thread if you'd like, and I use a size 10 beading needle. Alrighty, let's thread our needle with 6 feet of thread, and then we can get started. So I have threaded my needle, and now I'm ready to pick up my first unit. Making sure that the unit has, on the top quadrant, has the 3 different parts of the candy canes. If you'll notice, this quadrant has 2 candy canes, and this one only has one. So the top is the one that has the 3 parts. Okay, and making sure that the almost completed candy cane is on the left hand side, and the one that's just got a couple, like 3, is on the right hand side. What we're going to do is turn it to the side, and we're going to sew through the middle red bead right there. We're going to pull our thread all the way down until we've got about a 2-inch tail. And then we're going to hold on to the thread with our thumb. Now I'm coming out of the top of this red bead. I'm going to sew in the opposite direction in the bead right next to it. So now we're coming out of the bottom of this white bead. Let's sew in the opposite direction in the bead right next to that one. And by zigzagging like this, we're making it easy to lock in our tail. So now we're going to sew up 1 more bead, hiding our thread at all times. You don't want to see your thread at all in between beads, and then sew through 1 more bead. And now we are ready to pull our tail. Now, if you are not having any luck in using this technique, then you can always just cut your thread right there, cut the tail off. But I like to save as much thread as possible. So what I do, and this is why I'm starting in a red bead, because it's easier to see that white tail disappear into the red bead. Do you see how it just disappeared? Now I'm coming out of this white bead right here out of the top. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew down the bead right on the side of it, and then up the bead right next to that one. I'm going to sew up 2 more beads, and my thread is now very secure. Like I can tug on it and it's not going to come out. Okay, so if you feel like it's not secure, you can always zigzag again, going down the bead right next to that one and up the bead next to that one. That zigzag is what keeps it in place. Alrighty, now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to work my thread, sewing through 1 or 2 beads at a time until I get to this top bead right here. You do that as well, and I will meet you right there. Alrighty, so now we are up at this top bead. Let's now sew down 2 beads, 1 and 2. Now this is our top. This is where we hid our tail. We are now going to attach another number 1 unit to the right side of this unit. So making sure that the top is the one that has the 3, we're going to attach the side that has the 2 to the side that our thread is at that has the 1. Okay, so let's do that by sewing through this second bead right there. See where the 2 is going to meet the 1? So we're sewing through that second bead, and then we're going to just go back and forth. So this is the first unit. We're sewing through the second up bead on the first unit, and then we're going to just catch the third bead on the second number 1 unit, and then we're going to keep on lacing it together just like as if we were lacing up some shoes, and catching each one of those up beads until it's completely connected. We're going to zip it all the way up until we end in this bottom point bead of the newest unit that we just put on, and I will meet you there. Okay, so now we are coming out of this corner bead. Let's take another one of the number 1 units, making sure that the top is the one with the 3. We're going to add the one that has 2 candy canes to the one that has or to the side that has 1 candy cane. So to do that, we need to sew through the first 2 beads, 1, 2, and now we're coming out of that first up bead. Let's catch the second up bead on the newest unit that we're adding. And then we're going to once again catch each of the up beads back and forth, making sure that our thread is not crisscrossing at all. I'll show you kind of a close-up of what it's supposed to look like. No crisscrosses. And we're just going to zip it on up, catching each one of those up beads all the way up until we come out of this top bead in the newest unit that we just put on, and I will meet you there. So now we're coming out of this corner bead, and we're going to add our first number 2 unit. That's our Christmas tree. So making sure that this one single red lines up to the top of this candy cane right here. We're going to sew through our first bead on the big unit, getting our thread in position to now sew through the first sticking out bead or up bead on the Christmas tree unit. Okay, so now we're going to do the same thing. We're going to zip it up, sewing through one up bead, then the next, making sure that our threads are not crisscrossing at all, pulling it tight together, and go ahead and zip it all the way up until you are coming out of this corner bead on the big unit, and I will meet you there. So now we're coming out of this corner bead. Let's sew down 2 beads and getting our thread in position to add another number 1 unit, making sure that our 3 candy canes are up at the top, and we're connecting the 2 candy canes to the side that has the 1. So we're going to catch this second up bead, and then the second one on the big unit, and the third up bead, making sure that our threads are not crisscrossed. We're going to pull tight and zip it all the way up until we've come to this corner bead on the newest unit that we just added, and I will meet you there. So now we're coming out of this corner bead. Let's sew up the next 2 beads. And now we are in position to put the 5th and final number 1 unit onto the big unit. So once again, making sure that the 3 candy canes are in the top quadrant. We're going to connect the 2 candy canes to the 1 candy cane by catching that second sticking out bead or up bead, and then catch the second on the big unit and the third on the new unit. Pull it tight Zip it on up, and I will meet you in the corner bead on the newest unit that we just added. I'll meet you there. So now we are coming out of this corner bead. Let's sew through one bead, putting our thread in position to add our second number 2 unit, which is the Christmas tree unit, making sure that the one red bead is on the left hand side. That's the side that we're going to start on. We're going to sew through that first up bead, and then the second up bead on the big unit, and the second up bead on the new unit. And making sure they're not crisscrossed, let's pull them together and zip it on up until you've gotten to this corner bead on the big unit, and I will meet you there. So now we're coming out of this corner bead. Let's sew down 2 beads, 1 and 2, and now we are ready to connect our 5th number 1 to our first number 1 unit. So just catch this second up bead, and then the second up bead on the 5th number 1, and the third up bead on the first number 1, making sure that our threads are not crossing. Pull it tight, zip it on up until you are coming out of the corner bead on the first number 1 unit, and I will meet you there. Okay, so now we're coming out of this corner bead. We have all 5 of our beads in a circle. We're going to tighten up that circle by sewing through each one of the 5 beads. So sew through 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And now let's do that one more time, but we're only going to sew through 4 this time. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Pull it nice and tight, and you'll see that that circle just tightens up perfectly. Now we're coming out of this bead right here. Let's sew through the bead that's right below it. And now a very important part of, and you're going to see that you do this very often while we're adding all of our units. This second row has 3 beads in a row. You want to make sure that you go through that center bead. And now you can sew up all of these rows, picking random beads. It doesn't have to be any specific bead once you go through that middle one. And just sew all the way up, making sure that there is no thread showing. You're hiding your thread. And you want to continue to do this 1 bead at a time up each row until you get to the center bead up at the top that has the 3 beads in a row. Okay, and I will meet you there. Okay, so now we're coming out of this center bead. We're going to sew up the bead above that to the right and the pointer bead also. Then we're going to sew through 1 bead, putting our thread in position to add another number 2 unit, which is the Christmas tree, making sure that the 1 red bead is on the left hand side. We're going to sew through the first up bead, and then the second up bead on the big unit, and the second up bead on the Christmas tree unit, and we're going to zip it on up until we get to this corner bead on the newest unit that we just, oops, it fell. The newest unit that we just put on, and I will meet you there. So now we're coming out of this corner bead. Let's sew up the next 2 beads. And now we are in position to add our first number 3 unit. So making sure that our snow is going to connect in this way, and you'll also notice that this big snowflake comes together like this also, okay? So if it's the other way around, then if it's backwards, you'll see that there's 4. You don't want 4, you want 3 little white beads to make your snowflake, okay? So 3 beads make the snowflake. That's how you know you've got it on the right side. You can also tell because your yellow bead is on the right hand side. So we're not going to sew on this side just yet. So we're coming out of this first up bead. Let's sew through the second up bead on your number 3 unit, and then your second up bead on the big unit, and go ahead and zip it on up until you get to this corner bead on the newest unit that we just put on, and I will meet you there. So now we're coming out of this corner bead. Let's sew through 1 bead, and we are now in position to add our first number 4 unit. That's our top tier unit, and making sure that, if you'll notice on the top of this, we have 3 beads on the top of this quadrant and 4 beads on the top of this quadrant. We want to make sure that there are 4 beads on the right hand side, okay? So we're going to catch our first up bead on our number 4 unit, and our second up bead on the big unit, and our second on the number 4. Go ahead and zip it on up all the way until you get to this corner bead on the big unit, and I will meet you there. Okay, so now we are coming out of this corner bead. Let's sew through 2 beads, and now we are in position to add another one of our number 2 units, which is the Christmas tree. Making sure that on the bottom we have the 1 red on the left hand side, okay? The reason I tell you that is that if it's flipped over on the wrong side, you'll see more than just the 1 red, and you don't want to connect it that way. You want to connect it this way, okay? So we're going to connect on the left hand side of our number 2 unit. So let's sew through the second up bead, and then the second up bead on the big unit, and then the third up bead, and now we can zip it on up until we are coming out of this corner bead on the newest unit that we just added, and I will meet you there. So now we're coming out of this corner bead, and what we're going to do is tighten up our circle again. So let's sew through 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then do that again. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Pulling it nice and tight. Let's sew through the bead right below the one we're coming out of. And remember, this is where we sew through that middle bead in the row of 3, making sure we get through that middle bead. And that actually sets us up to start doing our shoelace again. So sew through the second up bead, and then the second up bead on the left side, and the third up bead, and the third up bead on the left side. Zip it all the way up until you get to this bead on the Christmas tree unit, and I will meet you there. So now we're coming out of this corner bead. Let's sew up 2 beads. 1 and 2. And now we're ready to add another number 3 unit, making sure that the little white bead is solo right here. It's just one white bead, as opposed to there's 2 white beads right here. So one white bead, and it's going to make a little snowflake of 3, right? So you're going to sew through this second up bead, and then the second up bead on the big unit, and the third up bead, and the third up bead on the big unit, and zip it on up until you get to this corner bead right here, and I will meet you there. So now we're coming out of this corner bead. Let's sew through 1 bead, putting our thread in position to add another number 4 unit, making sure that we have 3 beads on the top left and 4 beads on the top right. We're going to connect the bottom by picking up that first up bead, and the second up bead on the big unit, and the second up bead on the newest unit. Go ahead and zip it on up until you reach this corner bead on the big unit, and I will meet you there. So now we're coming out of this corner bead. Let's sew down 2 beads, and now we are in position to attach the Christmas tree to the snowflake. So let's sew through the second up bead on the Christmas tree, which is that lower yellow, and then the second up bead on the snowflake, and then the third up bead on the Christmas tree, and the third up bead on the snowflake, and we're going to zip it all the way up until we end in this corner bead right here, which is the corner of the Christmas tree unit, and I will meet you there. So now we're coming out of this bead. Let's sew through all 5 of our corner beads. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and let's do that through, we'll sew through 4 more. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Pull nice and tight. Let's sew up the bead right above the one that we're coming out of, and then sew through that middle bead in the row of 3. Now we're going to sew through 1 bead in each level, in each row, and hiding our thread all the way. We're going to continue to just pick random beads until we get to this bead right in the middle of the row of 3, and I will meet you there. So now we're coming out of this middle bead. Let's sew up the yellow that's above it, and then through the corner bead, the pink bead, and now we're going to sew down 2 beads, 1, 2, and we are in position to add another number 3 unit, making sure that the 1 little white bead will connect, making it 3 bead, a 3 bead snowflake. So let's catch this second up bead, and then the second up bead on the big unit, and the third up bead. We're going to zip it on up until we get to this corner bead right here. That's in the newest unit, and I will meet you there. Okay, so now we're coming out of this corner bead. Let's sew up 2 beads. 1 and 2. And now we are ready to add our 5th and final Christmas tree unit, making sure that the 1 bead is going to connect to the 2, so it makes a 3 bead triangle or snowflake, catching the second up bead, and then the second up bead on the big unit, and zipping it on up until we get to this top corner bead on the newest unit that we just added, and I will meet you there. So now we're coming out of this top bead. Let's sew through the next 2 beads, and now we are ready to add another number 3 unit, making sure that there's only 1 white bead on this side. We're going to catch the second up bead, and of course we're going to zigzag and zip it on up until we've reached the corner bead on the big unit, on the corner where the Christmas tree of the Christmas tree unit, and I will meet you there. So now we're coming out of this corner bead. Let's sew through 2 beads. And now we are in position to connect these 2 units. So let's sew through the second up bead. And then the second up bead on the first side. And the third up bead on the bottom, and making sure that nothing's crisscrossed. Pull it tight, zip it on up, and I will meet you in the corner bead of the one on the right hand side. I'll meet you there. So now we're coming out of this corner bead. Let's tighten up our circle by sewing through 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 corner beads. Pull it tight, sew through 2 more. 1 and 2. Now let's pull it nice and tight so none of our thread shows. And now we're coming out of this bead. Coming out of this bead, and we're going to sew through the next bead that it is right next to. And now you'll notice that we are going to sew through the middle bead of the row of 3. So it's very important that you sew through that middle bead. And now we're going to just sew through random beads, making sure that we don't skip a row. Just sew through 1 bead per row until you get to the top. And we're going to just pick random beads until you get to this top middle bead right here, and I will meet you there. So now we're coming out of this middle bead, which is yellow. We're going to catch the next bead right above it on the right hand side, and then sew through this top corner bead. And then we're going to sew on the first top bead, putting our thread in position to add another number 4 unit. So now we are ready to add what I call the top tier unit. Remember that on the left hand side, the side that we're starting on, well, we're starting on the bottom, but on the left hand side is 3 beads on the top, and then on the right hand side you should have 4 beads on the top. So we're not going to sew on this right hand side, but it's very important. And so we're going to catch this first up bead. I don't know why I keep going out of screen, out of the shot, but my hands keep moving over to the right. I'm gonna have to keep telling myself not to do that. Let's see if reminding myself will make it better for the rest of the video. Oh my goodness. Okay, and go ahead and zip it on up, just like we have, all the way up until we end in this corner bead right here, right on top of, it's actually on the right hand corner of the snowflake, the number 3 unit. So I will meet you there. Okay, so now we're coming out of this center bead. Let's sew up the yellow bead right above it, and the corner bead above that one. I happen to catch both of them. And now we're going to sew down the yellow bead right under the corner bead. We're going to sew down the yellow bead right under the one that we're coming out of on the left hand side. And then we're going to sew up the center bead. And now we're going to sew up the pink bead and through the corner bead. And then sew through the next bead. This is the first one that's on the top. And now our thread is in position to add another top tier or number 4 unit, making sure that there are 4 beads on the top right hand side. That way we know that we're putting it in the right position. We're going to be sewing this bottom part, so let's catch the first up bead on the bottom row and the second up bead on the big unit and the second up bead on the bottom row. Zip it on up and let's end in this corner bead on the big unit, and I will meet you there. So now we're coming out of this corner bead. Let's sew through 2 beads, 1 and 2, and now we can connect this unit to the unit that we already have in place. We're going to catch the second up bead and the second up bead on the left side. Go ahead and zip it on up until you get to this corner bead on the corner of the Christmas tree, and I will meet you there. Okay, so now we're coming out of this corner bead. Let's zip up our circle by sewing through 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and let's sew through 4 more. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Pull it tight. Let's sew through the bead right next to the corner bead that we're coming out of, and then sew through that middle bead on the row of 3. And now just pick random beads to sew through, 1 in each row, until you get to this middle bead right here, and I will meet you there. So now we're coming out of this middle bead. We're going to sew up the yellow bead right above it and the corner bead, and then we're going to sew through 2 beads, putting our thread in position to add our 5th number 3 unit, making sure that there is only 1 little white bead on the left hand side. That's the side that we're going to be sewing on. So catch that second up bead and then the third, and we're going to zip this one on up until we get to this corner bead on the newest unit that we just added, and I will meet you there. So now we're coming out of this corner bead. Let's tighten up our circle by sewing through 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and we'll do that one more time. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Pull nice and tight, sew up the bead right below it, and then sew through that first up bead, which is the center bead. Now before we zip it up, we'll want to put our plastic crafting ornament inside. If we zip it up first, then the ornament won't fit in. So make sure that you put your ornament in now and then zip it on up until you get to the top corner bead on the number 3 unit, and I will meet you there. Alrighty, now let's sew through the next bead. And now we are ready to add our 20th and last unit, making sure that the 4 beads are on the top right. We're going to be sewing on the bottom, starting at the bottom right, picking up that first up bead and then sewing through the next, and then the second up bead, and zip it on up until you get to this corner bead on the big unit, and I will meet you there. So now we're coming out of this corner bead. Let's tighten up our circle by sewing through 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now we're going to do something a little different, because if you notice, this bead is not even close to the other bead, and it will continue to kind of pop up like that if you don't put this bead under control. So we're going to sew through the bead, sew down the bead right next to the bead we're coming out of, and pull tight, and that will tighten up our 5 beads, and then sew up the bead, the yellow bead right next to that one. And that is enough to pull it into place so it won't pop up so much. And now sew through that top corner bead. Pull tight and sew through 2 more corner beads, 1 and 2. And now we are in position to sew up the first bead right next to that corner bead that we're coming out of, and we can sew through that middle bead of the 3, the row of 3, and now we can start catching our up beads. So zipping it on up until we get to this top bead right here, and I will meet you there. Okay, so now we're coming out of this top bead. You'll notice that there's a little gap. We're going to have this in between every single one of these. So in order to bridge that gap, I just kind of push the ornament over to the side, and we're coming out of the top of this bead, so let's sew down the bead, bridging that gap. Don't pull too tight just yet, because you need to give it some reinforcement. So let's sew down the bead right below that one, sew up the bead right next to the one we're coming out of now, sew up the bead, the 4th one from the left, And now you can pull tight and sew down the bead that we originally were coming out of. And now we want to move our way over, continuing to follow our thread path. So in order to do that, you'd think that you could just go up this one and down this one, but you can't because there's not a thread right here. So what you need to do from this third one over is sew down the one below that, sew up the one right next to that one, and now you can sew up that last bead in this top row. Now we can follow our thread path by sewing down the bead in the next quadrant, sew up the bead right next to that one, sew down the bead right next to that one. Now once again, you're going to want to end sewing down this fourth bead. So to do that, we need to sew down the second bead in the second row, up the pink bead right next to it, and then up the second bead in the top row, and down the fourth bead in the top row. So now we are in position to go ahead and zip this up, but I'm going to give you a little hint on how to stop from catching on this little guy. If you hold on to the big silver cap and you just pull the loop, you'll notice that it will hold itself. It's got like little feet under there that hold it in place, and then you can just lift it off, and it makes it so much easier to put it back on too. I'm just going to set it aside and not have to bother with it, but once we get to putting it back on, all we will be doing is putting it on and popping down that loop, and it locks it in place. So once again, hold on tight to the base, pull it up until the little feet are holding it, and pull it off. And we're just going to set that aside now. And now it's totally out of the way and it won't catch our thread as much. Alrighty, we're in position to zip it on up. So let's catch the first up bead on the right hand side and the second up bead on the left side. Go ahead and zip it on up until you get to this corner bead on the right hand side, and I will meet you there. So now we're coming out of this bead. Let's tighten up our circle by sewing 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and sew through 4 more. 1, 2, 3, and 4. And sew up the bead right above that one, and then sew through the middle bead in the row of 3 and pull tight. And now go ahead and pick one bead randomly in each row until you get to this top bead, which is the third bead from the right. We're going to end up filling in that gap or bridging that gap, and I'll meet you there. Okay, so now we're coming out of this third bead from the right. Let's sew down the fourth bead, bridging that gap, and then sew down the bead just under it to the left, and sew up the bead right next to that one, and sew up that fourth bead from the right. Now we can pull tight, sew down the bead we were originally coming out of, sew down the bead right under that one to the right, sew up the bead right next to that one, and up the very last bead in that quadrant on the top. Now we can jump over to this quadrant, sewing down. Oh, it wants to catch two beads. Well, it wants to catch two. There we go. Sometimes you just gotta fight with it, right? Sewing down the next bead, sewing up the white bead, the one that's furthest on the right. Oh, am I showing you that? Yes, I am in camera shot. Yay. And then sewing up the second pink bead on the top from the right, and down that fourth bead over. So now we are in our up bead. At this point, I'm going to make sure that our ornament is in place where it's supposed to be. We won't have too much trouble, but we might get a little caught on our little cap part. But now we want to attach this part. So let's go ahead and catch that first up bead. And I would suggest sewing through quite a few of these up beads, lacing them up while you're zipping it on up before you pull it tight. And the reason for it is you don't want to put too much pressure on these top beads. You certainly don't want to break a bead at this point. So I sew through like 8 or 9, maybe 10 of them, and then I pull. And we still have that little gap that we're going to have to cinch up, but we're going to work our way all the way down until we end in this bead right here, and I will meet you there. So now we're coming out of this corner bead. Let's tighten up our circle by sewing through 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and then sew through 4 more. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now we're coming out of this bead. Let's sew through the bead right above it, and then sew through the middle bead in the row of 3. Pull nice and tight, and now go ahead and sew up all the way up until you reach this bead right here, and I will meet you there. So now we're coming out of this bead. Let's bridge the gap by sewing down the bead right there, and then sewing down the bead to right under it that's to the left. I'm actually going to push that to the side. The cap part really does get in our way, but that's okay. We're dealing with it as we can. Now sew up the bead right next to that one, and up that 4th bead from the left. Pull tight, and sew down the 3rd bead from the right, down the third bead on the second row from the right, up the second bead from on the second row, and then up that corner bead in the quadrant. Let's sew down the first bead. It always tries to do. I can sew, I guess, under that second bead. Let's sew down the next bead, up the bead right next to that, up the second bead from the right, and up the second bead from the right again. Now we are in position to sew down that fourth bead, and now we're ready to zip this one up, remembering to grab at least 8 or 9 of these beads before we pull tight. Go ahead and zip it on up until we get to this bead right here, and I will meet you there. Alrighty, so we are coming out of this bead. Let's tighten up our circle by sewing through 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Let's do that 4 more. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Pull nice and tight. Sew through the bead right above the one that we're coming out of, and sew through that center bead in the row of 3. Pick your random beads, 1 row at a time, until you reach this bead right here, and I will meet you there. So now we're coming out of this third bead. Let's bridge the gap by sewing down the fourth bead, sewing down the bead right under that one, it's going to give me a hard time, only because I know better than to force it. Well, it looks like it wanted to catch 2 beads, so that's okay. If that happens, we can always weave it back where it's supposed to be. So we're coming out of this white bead. Let's sew through the pink bead, and then sew through the bead above that one. And now we can sew through the fourth bead from the top, or on the top, and pull tight. And now we can sew down the bead that we originally started from, and down the bead right below that one, up the bead next to that one, and up the very last bead in that top row in this quadrant. Alrighty, now we can sew down the bead in the first quadrant, down the bead right below that to the right, up the bead right next to that one, up the third bead on the top, and down the fourth bead. Last time, let's zip this on up, making sure that we sew through 8 or 9 before we give it a good tug. And I will meet you in this corner bead right here. Alrighty, now we're coming out of this corner bead. Let's tighten up the circle by sewing through 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and sew through 4 more. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Pull tight, sew through the bead right above the one we're coming out of, sew through the middle bead in the row of 3, and now catch our random beads, 1 in each row, until we end in this bead right here, and I will meet you there. So now we're coming out of this bead. Let's sew down the bead 4th from the left, bridging that gap, and then sew down the bead right below that one. Sew up the bead right next to it, and then up that 4th bead from the left again, and pull tight, sewing down the bead that we originally started in. It doesn't want to let me, so don't want to force it. Just going to keep on trying until it lets me. There we go. And down the bead right under that. Now we have actually bridged all of our little gaps. You can put your little bobble hole right in the center. And let's now just finish off our thread very simply. Just sew down 2 more beads. 1, 2, then do a zigzag. 1, 2, don't want to force it. It starts getting tight. You know that it's forcing it, so don't do it, because that's when we break beads. At this point, I really should trade to a size 12 needle, but because I'm so stubborn and I know I can get it, I'm going to try. There we go. Persistence always pays off. Gentle persistence. So now we've zigzagged once. I want to do that one more time. So let's sew down 2 more beads, just so we know that thread is not going to unravel. And now I'm going to sew, I'm going to do a zigzag, sewing up 1 bead and down 1 bead, and sew through 2 more beads, and then we will cut the thread. I always do 2 zigzags. It just makes me feel comfortable. All my little quirks. Alrighty, so let's cut the thread now. Let's hold our thread with our long nose pliers. Take our scissors, cut the thread right off. And now we can make sure that our little hole is in the center. We can put our cap back on. So we still have the little feet holding it on the inside. We're just going to put it right on top and push it down, and it locks it in. It's nice and sturdy. Now we get to put beads around the cap, making it blend in with the rest of the beaded ornament. So let's do that. We'll pour out our little piles of pink, white, and yellow beads and thread our needle with 2 feet of thread, and then we can start beading the cap. So now I have threaded my needle and I have picked up my first 40 beads. So pick up 40 pink beads and leave about a 6-inch tail on this side. I'm going to take my tail and just twist it around my finger a couple of times because that makes it easier for me to hold on to the thread and manipulate the beads. Now I'm going to sew through the first bead that I put on, creating a circle with my beads. Now I'm going to pick up one more pink bead, and I'm coming out of this bead right here. I'm going to skip the next bead and sew through the bead after that. Then I'm going to pick up one more pink bead. I'm going to skip the next bead and sew through the bead after that. Trying to keep a tight tension on my beads so that they fall into place where they're supposed to. And it's not very easy in the very beginning to get them into place, but by the 4th or 5th, they'll definitely be into place. So pick up one more pink bead. We're coming out of this bead. Let's skip the next bead and sew through the next. And you'll notice that the beads are starting to fall into place, except for that second one. Here it goes. It was being finicky at first. Okay, so this is what it will start to look like, where there's 2 beads, then 1, then 2 beads, then 1, then 2 beads, then 1, all the way around, adding 1 pink bead at a time, skipping 1 bead and sewing through the next one until you've added 20 beads, and I will meet you on the 20th. I'll meet you there. So now you should have what looks like this. And here is our tail, and here is our working thread. I've picked up my 20th and last bead, and I'm skipping the bead and then sewing through the bead after that, as well as stepping up, so sewing through that second bead. So now we should have a nice little ring of peyote, circular peyote. And what we're going to do is we're just going to slip this ring right on top of the cap. And it is a very snug fit, but 40 Delicas fits on this cap perfectly. If you find that your cap is a little too big and you need to add a couple of beads, just make sure that you start with an even count. So I started with 40 beads. If you need a bigger ring, then jump up to 42. If you need your ring to be smaller, then jump down to 38, but always stay at an even number in the very beginning ring. Okay, so now we have our cap on, and I want to be able to come out of this top tier right here, and right now my thread is coming out of a bottom bead. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to sew through the next 2 beads so that it is now coming out of the top bead. And you can pull on it and make sure that it gets as tight as possible. It's very helpful if it starts out very, very tight. Okay, so we still have about 6 to 8 inches on our tail. So what we're going to do is we're going to just start beading around, adding 1 bead at a time. This time we're going to do a ring of white beads. So 1 bead at a time. Let's add 20 beads, sewing through 1 up bead at a time. That way you have a white bead in between each pink bead. And I will meet you as we are adding our 20th white bead. So I'm now adding my 20th bead. I'm going to sew through the pink and step up on the white bead, step up through. So now our thread is once again on the top row. We have added 20 beads. Let's do this again, adding 20 more white beads, one at a time. So just filling in the little gap each time. And we'll do this all the way around, adding 20 one at a time. And I will meet you when we're adding our 20th. So now I'm adding my 20th bead, and I'm going to sew through the next bead and also the second bead. So sewing through 2 beads, stepping up, and now we have all 20 in this row. Now we're going to do the same thing with yellow beads. So let's pick up one yellow bead at a time and add our yellow beads one at a time until you've added 20 yellow beads, and I will meet you on the 20th bead. Okay, so now I'm at my 20th bead. Once again, we're going to sew through the final bead and step up by sewing through the second bead. And now we've completed that first row of yellow. Let's do the same exact thing, adding 1 bead in between each yellow bead until we've added 20. And I will meet you on the 20th one. Alrighty, we are ready to add our last bead. So we're going to sew through and step up. So sewing through 2 beads, and now we're going to pull nice and tight in both directions, making sure that our cap is not falling off at all. And now we can weave our thread through and cut it off. So what we want to do is we want to do that zigzag again. We're coming out of this bead, we're going to go the opposite direction and the bead right below it, and then the opposite direction again and the bead below that. Pull nice and tight. Sew through 2 beads, the one in front of that, and then maybe the pink bead in front of that one. And then we're going to go in the opposite direction again. Going through the bead right next to that, and then the opposite direction of the yellow bead. I'm also going to catch the yellow bead that's under it. And maybe 2 more beads. Pull the thread through and take it off of my needle. Once again, pulling nice and tug it nice and tight, I mean, a nice firm tug, and then we can cut this one. So holding it with the long nose pliers and getting as close to the bead as possible, I'm going to snip that little one off. Now we just have to deal with our tail. So I'm just going to thread the needle and do the same exact thing. I'm going to, let's see, we're coming out of this bead right here. So let's zigzag, going the opposite direction, and then once again the opposite direction. Sew up 2 beads, 1 and 2, and then zigzag again. Opposite direction, sew up 2 more beads and cut. 1 and 2, pull nice and tight. Make sure that cap is nice and firm on there. Hold the thread our scissors as close to the bead as possible and snip it off. Now all we need to do is put our ribbon on. So you'll need 12 inches of a 3/8 inch wide ribbon. Go ahead and get that, and we will put the ribbon on next. That was so much fun. Thank you so much for being here with me today and beading along with me. I really enjoyed this project, and I hope that you just love your ornament now that it's complete. Remember to like and subscribe and hit that bell button so you're notified when the next video comes out. I have a whole new project ready to start, and I can't wait to see you there. Thanks for watching. So here I have my ribbon. I'm going to fold it in half, and I'm going to try to meet up the edges as close to as possible. Then I take my 2 fingers and I wrap the edges around those 2 fingers, making a little loop, and then I'm going to tuck it under, and I'm going to try to pull this little knot neatly as close to these 2 edges as I can, leaving just a little bit. And so then it looks like this. Now we have this little loop right here. I'm going to pinch it closed and then pinch it in half so it looks like this. Then I'm going to take my loop and I'm just going to slide it through, open up the loop, and pull the ribbon through, and trying to keep it as square as possible. I'm going to pull it, and there you have your little ribbon, which is your hanger for your ornament. Now I like to add a 12-inch ribbon, but if you're hanging this on like a doorknob, or it's like a cat toy for you or something like that, then you can definitely put on a longer ribbon. The size of the ribbon is totally up to you. Well, you have completed your ornament, so I am so incredibly happy with mine. I hope you enjoy yours too, and I will see you in a second.